It's a pretty hard act to follow, so I hope you guys will help me out. The fortunate part is that the themes really resonate. They resonate not only with the findings that we found from our year 2 evaluation, but also in the whole construct that you've laid out for the Chronic Homeless Initiative at the foundation level and within the community as well. So I'd like to start by just going through and reminding ourselves of kind of what the initiative is really premised on. And then we'll go through some of those areas and dive a little bit deeper into some of the successes and some of the challenges and opportunities within each of those areas. So when we first began working with the Hilton Foundation and with all of you as community stakeholders, we just listened and tried to understand what you were proposing to do in the challenge of ending homelessness, and specifically looking at the 5 strategic goals that the foundation had adopted as part of the strategy that Ed discussed earlier. And we constructed a theory of change, and it kind of was just a way to organize all of the different activities into that common frame. So beginning kind of that building consensus that permanent supportive housing really is the solution to chronic homelessness, and part of that, probably that narrative that Manuel just referred to about helping to build just the human interest in solving the issues, maybe not solving the issues, in identifying the dream of everybody having a house who's currently chronically homeless, right? So that consensus is really the beginning of the frame. It's establishing the shared values. Translating that, recognizing from the very beginning the importance of political will in building up the allies. And that's not only just looking at elected officials, but appointed public officials kind of throughout, and political will more broadly in terms of those constituencies. The theory is that with more political will, then from there you gain more funding, support in decision making, changing those practices throughout our systems to support our efforts. And that simultaneously, the consensus to focus on permanent supportive housing would also need to then be followed into developing that capacity to actually develop and implement a permanent supportive housing strategy. The combination of more funding and greater capacity leads to more units, and not just more units, physical units, but units with those wraparound services and built on the model of supporting serving those who are currently chronically homeless and the most vulnerable among them. So that's kind of one aspect, a major aspect of the work. But simultaneously with that, it was saying if we're going to end chronic homelessness, we need to do a better job of identifying those who are chronically homeless and prioritizing among them so that we can really match those who are most vulnerable and have greatest needs with these new units that are coming online. So that was an important kind of parallel process of focusing on the prioritization systems and developing the capacity of permanent supportive housing providers and service both the housing and the service provider side to be able to actually provide the services to support housing retention. And one theme we'll talk about more today, the transition into other housing options after stabilization. So the theory of change suggests that all of those different elements come together to coalesce to help prevent and end chronic homelessness. So we're going to organize our conversation today around going through the progress in each of those areas, recognizing that if everything progresses, then you do move toward the successes of preventing and ending chronic homelessness, but that if you have certain pieces of your overall kind of effort that don't come together, then that's going to be kind of a broken thread that will prevent you ultimately from reaching the goal. So we'll dive down and talk about the successes, bearing in mind that I think we have found there have been tremendous progress in each of these areas. And so we're trying to balance the wanting to celebrate all that's occurred with, at the same time, wanting to seek out and kind of put before you ideas about recommendations to keep you moving forward. And so if this is the end of year 2, which is a fuzzy year, it doesn't follow a calendar year exactly, but the end of year 2 of a 5-year strategy, how far have you come and what else needs to occur to meet your broader goals within 5 years? And that will transition over. Carol is going to start by talking about political will.
Okay. And I think I just want to echo Brooke's both thanks to the Hilton Foundation and to all of you who have been tremendously responsive to our many questions as we've been gathering information and stories for this evaluation. So when we talk about political will, as Brooke said, we're talking about elected officials, primarily city and county government here, but to some extent we're going to talk a little bit about the need for change and political will at the state or federal level, as I think some folks have alluded to earlier. The work of local government agencies, the folks who day-to-day manage resources and programs in mainstream systems that don't have a full-time focus on ending homelessness. And we'll take a closer look at where we've got some results. So first of all, with the LA County Board of Supervisors. Over the last year, we saw the LA County Board of Supervisors launched the LA Interagency Council on Homelessness, and then more recently adopted a resolution that sets the stage for reprogramming homelessness prevention initiative resources with a greater focus on permanent supportive housing, and to have those investments informed by best practices that have emerged from the work of some of these efforts, as well as others, based on the LA County Interagency Council on Homelessness roadmap for addressing homelessness. The report notes that in terms of the allocations of the Homelessness Prevention Initiative HPI funding, there is some signs of some change, some progress in terms of increasingly targeting those resources to permanent supportive housing and solutions to chronic homelessness. So we noted that the amount of that total funding that's going to permanent supportive housing increased from about 1/3 to about 40%. Going to permanent supportive housing. And I think even more compelling is the finding that of the amounts allocated directly by members of the board for their own kind of pet projects, their own projects in their districts, this year, in the past fiscal year, about 80% of that money went into permanent supportive housing projects. So that is a sign that not only are elected officials saying that they recognize that supportive housing is the solution to chronic homelessness and that it's a valuable investment, they're putting some of that money where their mouth is. In terms of the City Council, the biggest victory in the last year was defeating the Community Care Facilities Ordinance. And I know many of you in the room were active participants in that advocacy effort. And so I think as one person described it, it's a victory or at least not a failure. And it would have been a big threat to the ability to keep moving forward in some of the work that you're doing. The housing authorities, we saw housing authorities really stepping up and making commitments of vouchers that would be focused on serving chronically homeless people, vouchers connected to services. And that's really fabulous. And at the same time, we saw that those funding commitments through the Funders Collaborative, it's been really challenging to fulfill those commitments given the impact of sequestration. I want to really call out the work of HACLA in particular for making an absolutely heroic effort to get as many of those vouchers under lease and get as many people into housing as possible before the door had to slam shut because of the impact of sequestration. And I think that's a huge example of the kind of leadership that made a real difference in people's lives. And is making a difference in changing systems, in changing who gets housed with the resources and the services that are connected by partner agencies like the Department of Mental Health and other partners. The Department of Health Services launched the Housing for Health initiative and took a really creative approach to getting the political leadership, the Board of Supervisors, to give the department the authority to enter into master contracts that allow the department to be nimble and to put resources in place when housing opportunities are available and get housing and services in place at the right time, in the right place for the people that we're concerned about, with that pre-qualified list of providers. And then at LAHSA, increased participation, encouragement for supportive housing providers to really boost their participation in the homelessness management information system, LAHSA's participation in the Skid Row coordinated entry, and helping to build a single inventory for permanent supportive housing. So these are really good examples of both elected and and agency leadership here, moving things in the direction of investments in permanent supportive housing and the goals of the initiative as a whole. But we see some real challenges. First of all, we see time limits in the LA County Board of Supervisors will lead to turnover in some really key leadership positions, some key board members and board staff who have really put a lot of personal interest in their political power attached to making investments in supportive housing, and a change in terms of a new mayor in the city of Los Angeles. I think what we also see, and we talked about here, is in many cases, going back to the point earlier, that 80% of the dollars allocated by board members under the Homelessness Prevention Initiative are going into supportive housing projects. That's good news. It makes a real difference in the lives of people. It demonstrates, some of these demonstration projects have really provided the evidence that helps to build political will and support for doing more. At the same time, as Manuel Pastor said this morning, it takes more than demonstration projects to change systems. And I think our real challenge as we look at political will is to kind of make that transition from demonstrations that have the support of an individual board member, a staff person, an individual working with community partners in one part of the county, to having the board as a whole embracing the goal of investments in supportive housing and being champions for public policies that make these solutions much more of standard operating procedure for county systems in this example. So that's a quick recap of the picture of political will. I'm going to talk about funding and aligned decision making. And you've got a handout. I think they've been distributed, this little kind of dashboard. And so the numbers that are in these slides are also in your handouts. So what we see is private funding commitments in 2012, 2013. We're continuing to grow the commitments and investments of philanthropy and private funders, making progress towards that goal of $15 million in leveraged resources. We're also seeing public funding leveraged towards permanent supportive housing through the work of the Funders Collaborative, and in part because we're seeing a 15-year valuation on the value of housing vouchers. We see that the funding commitments, at least the commitments, have exceeded the goals in the public sector, and that's fabulous. But again, we have some real challenges. We've got to continue to create more units of permanent supportive housing, either by developing new units or by dedicating existing units of supportive housing and affordable housing to provide the deeper services, the targeting in terms of who gets into that housing, as we'll talk about later, but to really have the capacity to house chronically homeless people every year, not just what we've done in the first 2 years of this initiative, but the challenge to continue to add and grow. And that requires really significant increases in funding as we look at what it takes to sustain, to provide the services and the supports and the rent subsidies, to sustain the people who were housed last year or the year before who still need ongoing assistance, and continue to provide the capacity in the system to bring new people off the streets and into permanent housing to end homelessness for them. I think one of the key challenges that we see around these units is how we can actually fulfill these commitments or find substitutes in terms of resources, as the vouchers have been frozen now because of the impact of sequestration, and as we watch the news unfold from Washington D.C., the kind of shutdown and showdown over what we're seeing, what we're going to see in terms of federal funding commitments in the next year. So we have service funding commitments from the Department of Mental Health and the Department of Health Services that were to be connected to housing vouchers from our housing authorities here in Los Angeles. The challenge is to figure out how to sustain those service commitments, attach those services perhaps to turnover units in existing supportive housing or affordable housing, to find other housing opportunities that we can connect those services resources to so that we don't lose momentum. I think what we also see is a real need to figure out how to replace and restore the funding for those vouchers. We'll talk about that in a minute. So when we talk about new units available, we've got good news. We've got new units of permanent supportive housing, some of which include units that were in the pipeline prior to this year that have come online and become available for occupancy during the first 2 years of this initiative. This is also in your handout that you've all got. And a large percentage of those new units of permanent supportive housing are dedicated to people who are chronically homeless. This is a real evolution, I think, in how resources are being allocated here in LA County. But we have challenges, as I mentioned earlier. The voucher's frozen, the critical support that communities have relied on in recent years to develop new units of project-based supportive housing. Redevelopment funding is gone. Our redevelopment agencies are gone, and the state funding through our state housing bond and the resources that were available in the early years of the Mental Health Services Act, those resources have been pretty much used up. So we have a really big challenge to create new sources of state funding programs, new sources of capital funding that can continue to drive the production of more supportive housing, more affordable housing that can include set-aside units of permanent supportive housing. And we've really got to get over that hump so that we can keep the engines fueled, if you will, for producing more units of supportive housing. We also have the cutback in federal funding for housing vouchers that I mentioned earlier, and as we face an uncertain future in terms of federal appropriations in the upcoming year, the likelihood that we're going to be facing a kind of permanently smaller supply of housing vouchers for people who need them in this community, and to find the ability to fulfill those commitments that have been made through the Funders Collaborative to link vouchers with services at a time when we have the systems and the partnerships in place to turn that spigot back on in terms of the flow of funding is going to be really critical. We saw, as I mentioned earlier, a huge a grassroots organizing effort to block the community care facilities ordinance in Los Angeles last year. We have not yet seen a similar kind of grassroots mobilizing campaign to build the political will to even raise public awareness of the impact of the loss of those vouchers. And I think that's an issue we identify in the report. And again, going back to the point of having the social movement that creates not only the idea and the evidence, but actually has an impact on those who hold power over decisions to be able to restore the funding that's needed to keep those vouchers going. Certainly there are temporary solutions. The Department of Health Services and others, the Hilton Foundation has provided support in terms of philanthropic support to try to step into this gap that's been created by the loss of vouchers by providing funding for a local operating subsidy, a local rent subsidy program. So building the political will locally to fill this gap in the short run and building the pressure on federal decision makers to restore that funding is certainly a challenge and an opportunity for the folks in this room and your partners and your allies in the year ahead. And I think at this point I'm going to hand it over to Julia.
Thank you. I'll go around. So even before this squeeze on the housing availability, part of the theory of change is that prioritizing this high service, high intensity resource of PSH to the most vulnerable folks was really a good idea. Obviously, as the housing resources become even more limited, this becomes even more critical. In the report, we talk about a number of prioritization efforts that have been going on in LA over the first 2 years of the initiative. We're going to focus today on one that is a very recent kind of a high energy pilot project that has just wrapped up its pilot phase. And we're gonna focus on the Skid Row CES, the Coordinated Entry System. And we're going to talk about the first 100 days of that campaign, and then a little bit about sort of what's next for that campaign and some challenges and opportunities that lie ahead. So this campaign kicked off, it was the first 100-day campaign, which wrapped up over the summer. resulted in a few key aspects of a prioritization process that we thought were important to highlight. First of all, they developed an assessment tool to really prioritize clients based on need. They also, nope, that's one. They also committed some temporary beds to make sure that they were able to sort of retain people while they were going through the application process and able to keep tabs on folks. And they also committed some move-in resources so that when those units became available, folks didn't have any obstacles to moving in if that was in fact a challenge for them. Perhaps most critically, they created a housing inventory of units that were really dedicated to this particular project and that could be matched on a real-time basis based on client need and eligibility. So a number of different housing providers participated, eligibility criteria for each of those providers was established, and then clients could be matched to the unit that made the most sense for them, and in fact was probably the most restrictive unit for them, so that the other less restrictive units could be made available to other folks. Also, as part of this process, they were able to streamline the housing application process so that all of the providers that participated were using the same application, and the voucher issuance timeline was really reduced for this particular project. And by the end of it, 37 units had been leased up in the first 100 days. And perhaps even more importantly, a lot of these sort of mechanisms had been put into place to continue this project going forward and to work out some of the kinks that might be needed to bring it to scale. And in fact, that's what's happening now as the project enters the next 100 days and 100 days after that, sort of set of cycles to really look at how they can bring the project to scale geographically. So moving it out from Skid Row into many different spas, or working in 7 spas altogether over the next 100 days. The challenges we see are really the challenges I think that Manuel talked about this morning, the idea of sort of moving from the pilot and taking some of the excitement that comes from a pilot project and really making it systematic, institutionalizing it. So one of the things that will be really critical to make that happen is making sure that enough PSH housing providers participate in this centralized entry system that it actually does become systematic. So it's not just a few housing units dedicated here and a few housing units dedicated there, that when they get leased up, then that particular part of the project is over. That this really becomes a mechanism for filling turnover on an ongoing basis for a really significant number of units. And actually, I was just talking to Mark earlier that this also seems like a great opportunity to connect as you think about the housing inventory piece of this project, to connect with the LASA PSH inventory group and make sure that you're taking advantage of those folks who are already thinking about what resources are out there. This also presents a really great opportunity to start thinking about tracking more closely folks on registries. That was one of the challenges we noted last year. It was a little unclear for those people who were on the vulnerability index registries if they were in fact the people who were getting placed into PSH. The PSH placement data is sort of reported in aggregate to Community Solutions and Home for Good. So it's hard to know if those are the exact same chronically homeless people that are actually on the registry list. So this particular coordinated entry process really could potentially lend itself to doing that level of tracking and really making sure that those are the folks who are getting placed. In the theory of change as a whole, you'll notice that we have 2 areas where we talk about capacity. We talk about the capacity to develop PSH. We also talk about the capacity to deliver services, way over there on the left. We're going to focus on the capacity of delivering the services when I talk about capacity today. So one of the areas that we cover in the report when we talk about capacity are the Home for Good Standards of Excellence. And the Standards of Excellence, you've probably all heard of, but they're being rolled out a little bit now more intensely than they have been in the past. They've existed for a while, but there's a real push to get the word out about what the standards are. The Standards of Excellence are essentially they're a set of outcomes that providers should aim to achieve, and they're coupled with some best practices that PSH and other types of homeless service providers should implement as part of their projects. We obviously focused on the PSH aspect of the Standards of Excellence, but it does cover a broader range of services. We have not had, up until now, and in fact we still don't, have a really clear way of measuring progress against the standards, sort of getting a sense of how many providers are meeting the standards. But what we do have is we did a community-wide survey, including quite a few PSH providers, where we asked a number of questions that mirror some of the aspects of the Standards of Excellence. So we prepared this little dashboard of sort of how we saw folks doing in those particular questions. And in some cases, we asked the same questions in 2012, and you can actually see growth. For example, more operators are setting aside units for chronically homeless folks. More providers told us that they were providing case management services. And in some cases, we're just setting benchmarks for 2013, and we'll ask again in future years and look for progress in the future. In terms of collaboration between operators and service providers, that was something we asked last year. We didn't see growth, we didn't really see any movement, but we did see that it was actually pretty high at 73%. So that's something that we'll look at measuring year over year, and in fact, if the Standards of Excellence folks who are working to implement that have additional ways to measure these metrics, we would be more than happy to look at those as well. We looked, because we didn't necessarily have a clear way to measure capacity, we asked a lot of different questions of a lot of different stakeholders about their capacity. So we kind of have a bunch of different ways of looking at capacity in terms of the challenges and opportunities that lie ahead. One thing in particular on the Standards of Excellence that we noted is that providers really gave us the feedback that if this does become a process by which they are measured, then it needs to be something that replaces other existing funder by funder metrics in order to streamline reporting, as opposed to just being something that layers yet one more measure onto the many, many reports that folks have to run. From a service delivery side, we really heard from both providers and clients that moving on support was really critical in PSH. There are certainly some clients in PSH who are going to need that level of support forever. But there are also lots of clients who will be stabilized in PSH and in some cases are ready to move on, or at least want to start the process of thinking about what moving towards more independent living might mean for them. And that there are then opportunities for the clients, for providers to really learn what that might take for folks. We also heard from a number of stakeholders that there was some need for provider capacity support, in particular in SPA 6, that was a particularly challenging geographic area. We also know from, and Brooke will talk about this in a minute, we know that there are capacity needs in SPAs 1 and 2 as well. But those are really more about the scope of services, whereas SPA 6 we heard was more just general capacity support. For all of the other providers, however, the last thing that I'll say that we heard was that there needs to be kind of a next level of support and training, that folks really kind of get the basics of PSH at this point, and that really what's needed is more focus on working with the most vulnerable population, with thinking about retention strategies, with thinking about these moving on strategies. So that was really what we heard from providers on capacity. And now I will turn it over to Brooke, who will talk about where this is all supposed to lead.
Great, thanks. So has it made a difference? That's really kind of the question of how do these efforts then coalesce at the ground level? And there has been, a lot of progress here. Okay, so results. So in the last 2 years alone, there have been almost 5,000 placements of chronically homeless individuals into permanent supportive housing. And that is amazing, right? So we want, and it's notable that there is a diverse array of housing with, new project-based housing, the scattered site housing we talked about. There's more opportunities because of those units in the pipeline. The prioritization systems are gelling. So there's a real potential to be able to launch and scale forward to make a big impact. It's also notable that the federal opportunities through the VA with the HUD-VASH program have made a huge difference in terms of the ability to support those move-ins, with almost 2,000 of the placements being placements in conjunction with the VA. So that progress, though, is kind of put within the landscape, the context of it really reinforces the need to continue to build the base, to continue to have the broader community understand what's happening throughout LA. This is a map of looking at the point in time counts from this year and the growth relative, the count is every 2 years. So the growth or change in counts from 2011 to 2013. So despite the 5,000 placements that occurred, there's still been significant growth, 20% growth in that chronic homeless estimate over the last 2 years. And what's really interesting is to drill down further and kind of look at the growth within the spas throughout the county to see that there are some areas more than others that seem to really have that notable growth. And it points then back to, we talked about this actually last February when we had a broader community conversation, but really thinking about how do you not only scale up, but scale to extend kind of your geographic targeting and focus. And so the coordinated entry work really deliberately looks to begin to establish a kind of prioritization effort within each spa, but is there a corresponding movement to increase the housing inventory, to think about turnover to the extent that there are existing permanent housing providers within the localities that could be part of the base. Really not just thinking about new units, although obviously any efforts to target existing units in that turnover to permanent supportive housing will have a corresponding ability to prevent chronic homelessness through other constituencies. So it's a real balancing act, but looking at that geographic diversity and thinking about the allies within each of the geographies, whether those are new housing authorities, new governmental efforts, whether it's building the capacity of specific permanent supportive housing providers or entities that could move to become permanent supportive housing developers. I think there's an opportunity to kind of dive in to look at the data differently. So this is just kind of depicting another look at what we showed in February, but this is with the new numbers of unmet need. So the estimate in terms of unmet need to be able to address chronic homelessness is another 10,000 units. So keeping up the momentum, that I don't say that to kind of have everybody, just like, have that kind of, oh, this is too overwhelming, but rather how do you think about scaling up from demonstration, from pilots, from these great opportunities that have happened where you've shown really demonstrated success, but you have to be very intentional about getting another 10,000 in and aligning then what does that mean in terms of new versus trying to increase the targeting efforts? What does it translate into funding? How do we get the funders collaborative to have a goal in terms of generating new funding that directly relates back to then creating the 10,000 units? Now, this isn't going to happen over the next 3 years as part of this 5-year strategic goal, but understanding and articulating, kind of having consensus as a group as to what you're aiming for within the next 3 years relative to a period in the future will help you organize your base and have a shared goal and kind of sense of progress as you move forward. The So that's kind of getting us to the big picture of the theory of change and how we're doing. And we really have seen documented gains in each of those areas. So this is just a summary slide of the result that's happened over the last 2 years and some of those challenges that may remain. We do see in each of the challenges opportunities. And so what we'd like to do is just take a minute to see from those of you here whether this resonates with your experience, whether there are surprises, not surprises so much in terms of the findings, but I think much of it you already know, but surprises in terms of what you've been able to accomplish that you never thought 2 years ago you would be here now, or the kind of conversation that you're having that you're surprised that it's gotten to this point, or areas that you hadn't imagined that you would have to grapple with. Anybody have any observations you'd like to share? I have to say that from my vantage point, a year ago, when we had the grantee convening, we had conversations about prioritization, and many people sitting around the table kind of expressed a lot of skepticism about whether this was possible in a county like LA. And the conversation, I feel like the language has completely shifted. So maybe that gets back to the earlier discussion this morning about the frame and the narrative changing. There's a sense of belief, a sense of the base understanding of what we're working on. It's not whether to establish prioritization, it's how. So I think that's, to me, surprising how much progress has been made in just 1 year since that point. Yeah? I don't know if, Kristen, if you want to do a mic or, okay.
Fair amount of permanent supportive housing down there. Obviously, the vouchers were still being issued. We have a lot of service providers, and the biggest need, of course. But when you said moving it out into a wider area, that's where it becomes a little more challenging because you don't have the skid row housing or SRO housing with permanent supportive units and so forth. And so I'm wondering, how not quite as many service providers and you're dealing in a much larger geographic area. So seems to be the big question is how do you actually then move that into a bigger area? So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Well, I would actually defer to you guys to talk about some of the plans to scale up, but I think that's exactly the conversation that's occurring right now, is how do you take that leap and how do you match, kind of going back to the broader theory of change, which is where if you have a system, you still need the inventory, right? And so getting the corresponding relationship between the two, where there are efforts to develop, efforts to identify those who are most in need, and that matchmaking component. And in some cases, it's a question of starting by matching with the limited inventory that may be there or be available. And in some cases, it's an effort to actually make sure that we're building inventory or using countywide resources that may be able to be directed into some of those underserved areas, right? So I think that I would invite you, I guess, to join that conversation and ensure that your creative thinking is part of the solution. Other observations? There's one in the back. I don't know if there's a mic nearby. I know they're eager to have folks speak into the mics.
Hi, I wanted to say thank you for sharing the results after 2 years. I think we have a lot of great momentum to your point, and after hearing Dr. Manuel Pastor present, I think where we've begun momentum, but we have so much more to do as we partner together, is that public awareness piece. So as part of your public will theory of change, or political will, public awareness and the individual empowerment to change hearts is still a place where I think we can do a better job. And I mean, we talk at an individual level about walking down the street and still seeing people sleeping in tents and on the street, and what can we do as individuals outside of our organizational efforts to address homelessness. And I think that that's a low-hanging fruit that maybe we could figure out together.
That's a terrific point and observation, and I think it's kind of one of our hopes for, especially this afternoon, as we have a smaller discussion with grantees, but is thinking about, okay, we each do our work from our individual spheres, but as individuals, how do we carry that beyond our professional work? As grantees, how do we carry the impact of what we're learning and doing within our grantee organizations to the broader external audience? So it really, in an intentional, organized way, to create that sense of a movement and not just ad hoc, simultaneous energy, right? So yeah, I think that there's a huge opportunity to take that next step, and perhaps that gets back to the idea of the revisioning and the leadership to make sure that you do kind of, instead of just thinking about the production goals and the prioritization goals, really making sure there is a concerted effort to organize and build the base. And right, so where's the outrage at the fact that we're still walking down the street and seeing individuals who are in need of housing and help? And other comments? Then I'll just quickly move to some of the recommendations, and there are many more recommendations highlighted. In fact, the back of the dashboard that we passed around, which gives you kind of the pulse of where you are on your goals, but on the back also a cheat sheet to some of the recommendations, and of course the report fleshes out some of these recommendations further. Ironically, many of the recommendations activities already started in this direction, so it's great to see alignment in some terms of some of our observations, and that you're also coming to many of the same conclusions. So from the government political will perspective, really an opportunity to educate and engage new leadership, and that's not just new leadership on the elected side, but really working with and many of the folks who are here in this room to think about how to change what have been exceptions to rules to make things work, to make that common practice. How to really have that institutionalizing the successes and lessons learned through the initiative thus far. On the research side, because we've identified, you've also, as a group, identified kind of the geographic disparity, digging deeper into the data to really understand what's behind those numbers. Who, are there certain subpopulations? Kind of do the needs vary with the geography? And so is there an opportunity to align some of the strategies differently, not just have a blanket approach throughout the county, but to have very intentional targeted strategies, and quantifying kind of that while there might be from the count and understanding that there's an increase in numbers, what can we learn about the detail behind the numbers? And is it relative to your prioritization criteria? So, how much of the increase is the kind of continuously long-term homelessness versus episodic homelessness, and how does that relate to the medical vulnerability and other factors that you've identified in terms of your prioritization? And then in terms of the research, talking the point that Julia was making, the opportunities to marry data on need with data on placement to make sure that you're validating that your prioritization systems are working. Looking and trying to tie in with some of the themes from the social movement conversation. So are we in it for the long haul? How do we address, kind of create this base? At a meeting at United Way yesterday, we were talking about sequestration and a sense that maybe your LA constituency was really on board and supportive, but that wasn't enough to move Congress. So how do you use your voice in other ways, through editorials or through kind of broader being part of a national dialogue, because sequestration is having such a huge impact on your ability to move forward. Similarly, there are other strategies at the state and even local level with your TIF dollars that you could use to ensure that resources are still getting focused on permanent supportive housing. And when there's a long-term strategy or solution in sight, developing interim funding strategies to make sure that you don't lose momentum in this near-term process. This, I think, the biggest theme of the report and of the conversation with Dr. Pastor this morning is kind of scaling up. How do we take what we've learned through small projects or targeted efforts or time-limited efforts and really achieve that kind of transformation for the system as a whole, so that there is this mobilized base, and this is just the beginning, but it can kind of have longer-term ripple effects and really address. We haven't talked at all yet today really about prevention, but if the numbers around the increase in chronic homelessness are showing, I mean, they could be reflecting that people haven't been counted before, they were there but not counted before, or other methodological observations, but it also could, if there is a surge associated with the increase in chronic homelessness, that means our prevention systems. We cannot lose sight of focusing on the systems that should be preventing people from becoming chronically homeless. How do we strengthen that simultaneous to our efforts to end chronic homelessness? And focusing on special target populations, especially related to prevention, but all the way through that life cycle. And the moving on strategies, as Julia mentioned, really reflecting that this is when we did consumer focus groups, those residents of permanent supportive housing voiced a desire to think about the next steps of housing. They may still need housing subsidies, or they may still need some level of supportive service, but what does that transition to the next step look like? And that is also an opportunity to help make sure that the solutions are sustainable, that you're not just building up continuous supply of permanent supportive housing for everybody who's chronically homeless, but by helping people who are now in permanent supportive housing transition to more independent living, then that also creates turnover that can help meet future need. Okay. So that really is kind of the highlights of the recommendations. As I mentioned, that we have on the dashboard some additional detail, and we just have about 10 minutes left that we can have broader discussion or answer specific questions. Have you all think about whether any of these recommendations resonate, or whether there are other ideas that you would like to add as you have the big group in the room, kind of plant the seeds of next steps. The microphone's on the way.
This may or may not be a next step, but I think a number of us are aware of the fact that we have a growing and aging baby boomer population that is moving toward the mid-60s, and we already have a significant number of homeless seniors in LA County, and I think it is wise for us to take into consideration how we deal with this new cohort of folks who may not be able to find affordable housing and may join the current numbers of unhoused homeless folks. So I think we have to keep that in mind as these, I should say those people get older.
Right. Yeah, it's an excellent point thinking about the demographic patterns and the kind of the trajectory of growth. And is there something that you could be doing today to prepare and think about those system linkages? And of course, nationally, I mean, the same phenomenon is occurring. There's research now looking at the kind of the demographics and the aging, and a concern that there will be a surge as the cohort of people experiencing chronic homelessness is aging, and as others are aging and still poor, what may be happening there, and simultaneously a cohort on the young end, that the systems are not in place to kind of get the long-term kind of economic services in place, and so you're seeing kind of a potential growth on the early end of the youth transitioning into adulthood. So I wonder if there are certain systems, thinking about those alliances possible, are there systems that are not currently engaged that primarily serve seniors who you might be able to involve in your planning? I mean, certainly one of the reasons we haven't seen a lot of kind of homelessness among seniors is because new social support systems open up. You have access to new resources as you age. So there may be opportunities to engage Social Security and Medicare and other systems as part of your strategy to be intentional about building those bridges and thinking about the housing relationship. And you also open up into opportunities for new housing resources, because oftentimes you do have senior public housing and other buildings that you may not be able to access when you're in your early 50s. Yep, Molly in the back. Again, the microphone's on the way.
I just think for me that educating the new political leadership really resonates. I mean, I think we're in a sort of unprecedented transformation in terms of political leadership, and we have half the city council that's now been in about, I'm trying to think, 3 or 4 months, and I think we really haven't spent the time with them that we need to, and I know it's been challenging. A lot of us have been thinking about the new mayor and There's, his office is still getting settled, and what's going to happen in terms of the Board of Supervisors. I mean, we just haven't seen this kind of turnover. And we really need to look at it as an opportunity that if we don't take advantage of it, we're going to lose an incredible momentum that we've been building. And I just think we got to figure out how to make the time and the resources to really spend time with these folks. Because I think a lot of them have really open ears. It's just that we're so bogged down that we're not taking the time to really educate them and work with them as true partners. So I'm glad you highlighted that. Thank you.
Great. Other next steps or issues that you think are just, if you were to think as a group, what you think you ought to be prioritizing to ensure that you do keep that momentum and thinking about the next 3 years? And I think the other piece that I really feel like just observing as an outsider, the kind of the funders collaborative and the successes, the interest and willingness of both your private and public funders to come together to align resources, and especially on the county side with services, finding ways to marry those services in very intentional ways with the housing vouchers and then using the private funding to fill in the gaps. I mean, that's really been remarkable. And taking that to scale has its own host of challenges, but the fact that it is an opportunity, the fact that it is a conversation that is very much, in progress, thinking about how like with the mental health services and the work that DMH has done, especially, DMH wasn't highlighted as much because a lot of that work occurred last year in terms of formalizing those relationships. But, then how do you ensure that you're getting people into the DMH system if they're not currently in it? And so that you can really take advantage of leveraging those resources. Similarly, are there ways in the absence of the housing vouchers, since the voucher commitments can't be fulfilled right now due to sequestration, can the services still move forward using turnover in other existing housing developments that may not have the services? So previously they weren't targeted to people who are chronically homeless because they didn't have a service connection. So can we start the service kind of in place to capitalize them? And I think that's really an opportunity, your turnover units, because you have a very large supply of permanent housing. So how do you really begin to tap into and build relationships with your permanent housing operators to capitalize on their turnover units, which is harder to build a system for turnover units because you have so many different players. And it's much easier if you have a chunk of units coming online at once that you can build a system to do the matchmaking. But ultimately, to see the real change, you're going to have to figure out kind of how to get the turnover, that day by day, single unit, 10 units coming on that you can tap into your registry and coordinated entry and do the matchmaking with the services. Well, if there aren't additional thoughts or observations, then we can keep moving on the agenda. Any last thoughts? Great. Well, thank you. I really want to thank, as we said earlier, the Hilton Foundation has just, I think, had great leadership, and the opportunity to have somebody to look from the outside, I hope is helpful. As we say every year, we want to make sure that this evaluation really meets your needs as the community organizing the social movement. And so if there are additional questions that we should be asking, areas that we should explore to help you, or if you think any of what we've presented, there's much, much more in the report, but also in the raw data that we've collected. We would be more than happy to mine that information to answer specific questions for you to help advance your work moving forward. So please feel free to contact us and let us know. Okay, thank you.